Make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Well, I teach American religious history in, year in, year out. And every year, I'm always struck by all the things that are old that remain. So I'm reflecting on the legacy of specific Christian communities and how that continues to play itself out over time. One example would be in the early weeks of a class that I teach on American religious history, we look at Baptists and Quakers. And we look at them as some of the original advocates and really creators of American concepts of religious liberty. And then the last time I taught the history of Christianities in the United States, we had just read about Roger Williams, famous figure, and the Quakers in what eventually becomes the United States. And then we read about how some of the first religious communities to legally challenge the Trump administration's policies regarding detaining people outside of churches through ICE, the communities who challenged that the first were Baptists and Quakers, right? So hundreds of years later, there are legacies of action in public and efforts to shape the American political project through their Christian conviction that you're seeing hundreds of years after the first communities even created our understandings of that. And to me, that is fascinating to watch and kind of thrilling to watch as well.
Hey, welcome back to Church and State, 250 plus years of faith in America, where we're looking at the role religion has played in shaping American life from before the founding to our current moment that we're living with today. I'm your political host, Wright, joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Burtram, and our guest today is Dr. Leah Payne. She is professor of American religious history at Portland Seminary and the author of God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music, where her work looks at the intersection of religion, politics, popular culture, worship, media, gender, and power. And we are just so excited to have her on the show for the first time to talk to us about a little bit about CCM and the role it's played in America's religious history. So welcome to Faithful Politics, Leah.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah. So your book, God Gave Rock and Roll to You, is a phenomenal read, by the way. And I learned so much about 3-button conspiracies and like PEPFAR and all kinds of stuff. So I'd love to just start our conversation maybe at like a high level for you, just to kind of help explain to our audience like what is contemporary Christian music. And, maybe more broadly, like give us sort of the high level view of like what type of impact has it had in American history?
Thank you so much. And I thank you so much for reading the book. And I can tell you actually did, which doesn't always happen. So truly from the bottom of my heart, it's an honor. So contemporary Christian music, which is a mouthful. And if you know what it's one of those things, if you know what it is, you really know what it is. If you don't know what it is, it's a little confusing. So contemporary Christian music, aka CCM, is a market niche. And it is a style of music that I trace about a 100-year history of this music industry. So my book is actually about a business, more as much or maybe even more than it is about music. And that market, the contemporary Christian music industry and the people that it serves, at the height of it was music that was made by and for and sold mostly to conservative white evangelical Protestants in the 20th century. And what the music could take on any style, but the aim was overall to create pop music that could attract and keep evangelicals, especially evangelical adolescents, teens, in the evangelical fold. And for most of the industry's history, contemporary Christian music created facsimiles of top 40 pop music that had evangelical Christian messaging in it. And usually that messaging was music, or what the message of contemporary Christian music was repeated talking points of powerful evangelical leaders. So if there was a big concern in evangelical Christianity, you could anticipate hearing a song that reflected that concern. So the value in studying contemporary Christian music, from my perspective, as a serious scholarly project, is you get this long-term conversation that ends up really being about evangelical ideals, but also hopes and dreams for how to raise children. Because contemporary Christian music, the top selling forms of contemporary Christian music, was music that was aimed at keeping children safe. So it ends up being a huge conversation musically about child rearing. And I have to ask you two, do either of you have any personal experience with contemporary Christian music? Because I'd love to know. That'll help guide the conversation.
I'll start because it's funny. Josh and I were chatting right before this interview because I just a little background. I came to the faith much later in life, 2008, and I came to the church along with my wife, her and I are both musically talented, and talented may be a stretch, but like we both know how to play instruments. So we were asked to lead worship for this small little Assemblies of God church that we had. And mind you, like, I'm new baby Christian on fire, I want to convert everybody kind of thing. And then like, our first set, she's like, well, what songs do you want to play? And I'm like, I never listened to contemporary Christian music my entire life. I grew up on like Two Life Crew, NWA, Debbie Gibson, Wilson Phillips. That's like my musical taste. And so I had suggested that we play Hallelujah. The song Hallelujah. Like the one. What's that?
The Leonard Cohen song?
The one that's in Shrek. I'm not sure who. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Wright covered it for Shrek. But anyway, yes, I know exactly. Beautiful song.
Yeah. And I was promptly told by my wife that we can't play that because that's not worship music. So my wife, who was also a PK, so like that was my first foray into CCM. But I'll let Josh give his testimony.
Yeah, I mean, I have had a lot of interaction with CCM. I was a worship leader at a previous church. I was associate pastor, so I did several ministries, and part of that was doing worship, leading, and then interacting with CCM and getting the licensing and all that kind of stuff. And you had to make sure you had it, especially if you were putting it out there on any kind of live stream or anything. And, people, feeling like you're, you hear it first, oh, this is cool. And then you're like, oh, wait, they're going to sue me if I do. And this is like, what's going on with this? And, you kind of realize that things are different behind the scenes. I used to talk to people like, when they would come and volunteer, and I'd say, it's kind of like when in Alice in Wonderland, and there's the person, who's behind the man behind the mask and the machine and all of that. And you kind of lift up, right, the veil, and you see the people working, right, and trying to do things. And you're like, oh, wait, it's not the Holy Spirit that just brings everybody together at the same time in the same place to sing the same songs. Like, and of course, I'm saying that a little bit tongue in cheek because I definitely, where I'm at, believe that the Holy Spirit works in the church and all of that as a Christian and works in the songs. And yet, of course, there's this human element to it that's very clear, that's there, that's obvious once you see it. And your work focuses on the music, media, celebrity, worship culture, right? And it's interesting that there even is this thing, worship culture, because even like worship music as a category, right? It's like worship music as a category. I think that kind of messed us up because like it made worship about singing, and it totally messed that word up from what it was in the Bible to what we think of it now. It's pretty ridiculous actually. But like, I think this is so important that we're looking at not just the politics, but the culture, because culture is really what pushes things forward. And we have talked to, it's like, you have strategy, or culture eats strategy for breakfast. And that's completely true, because it is our culture that drives our behavior. And I would just love to hear, why do these spaces matter? Why does music matter? Why does media matter? Why do we have to care about Christian celebrities? Why do they matter? Why does a worship culture matter? I mean, I heard you connecting some of these dots, but I'd love you to connect them even more, right? Looking at, well, then when there's a big issue, then you see songs about it. But why does this matter in general? These other elements that aren't like education, aren't politics. Why does it matter in general? And then even more specifically for our American religious history, how does this help us?
I love all of those questions. I'm going to try not to talk too long, so you just can jump in there.
I'm notorious for giving like 10 questions in one, so answer whatever one you want.
I love it. Okay, I'm gonna go for it here. I'm gonna do a little modification of this eats that for breakfast. And I will say that the story of God gave rock and roll to you and of contemporary Christian music in some ways could be told in that sentence, which is music eats doctrine for breakfast.
Yes.
And one of the things that I came to studying contemporary Christian music really because I had studied hard in school, wrote my first dissertation, or my first book. My dissertation was about two women preachers. I loved it, but like 12 people read it, including my mom. And so when I was trying to find, what else should I write about? Someone told me that, Pentecostal women preachers were too niche. I should write about something that was more broadly of interest, evangelicalism. And I thought, what could I say about evangelicalism that hasn't already been said? Then I realized, I used to work in contemporary Christian music. So I used to work in that business before I went to graduate school. And I thought to myself, everyone looks at CCM as though it is this kind of form of kitsch. A lot of people who grew up in evangelicalism come to feel as adults, especially as young adults, a little embarrassed of the fact that they used to like contemporary Christian music. Kind of it lives in a lot of people's minds in a realm of nostalgia. No one was really thinking about it, or at least I hadn't read a lot of accounts or really talked with a lot of people who in the scholarly world treated it like it was this very powerful form of identity creation and culture creation. But when I talked with people who had been formed by contemporary Christian music as human beings, especially as Christian practitioners, oftentimes they would say it was the top form of the top influence in their lives when it came to their spirituality. And when it came to forming their doctrines and their political orientations, the music and the culture around the music did way more for them. And one of the things that I trace in the book is that the mostly white revivalist communities that created contemporary Christian music. And one surprising thing that I found when I studied it is really there are 3/4 communities that create the overwhelming majority of music that you hear in the top contemporary Christian music world, and also in the worship industry, which is a later developing industry, but closely related in a lot of ways. They're either white Baptists, white holiness people, so Nazarenes, Wesleyans, those types, or the Pentecostals and eventually charismatics. And I could get into it, but charismatics are people who are not in Pentecostal denominations that practice Pentecostally. So they speak in tongues, they believe in divine healing, things like that. And the story of contemporary Christian music is a story of how those communities, oftentimes rural working class communities in the American South, and then eventually on the West Coast, how those communities go on to create the theological and political visions of millions of people outside of those places through music. And people like Billy Graham understood this very well and self-consciously used music in their activism and in their ministries. Billy Graham famously was converted, and a song that was playing that he went on to use in his revival meetings, Just As I Am, it's a very famous Billy Graham song. That happened to him when he was a teenager. he never forgot that. He understood that music was super powerful. And so his ministry, many other evangelical ministries, used that approach where they would go and get music that they thought engaged young people and paired music with their messaging. And it was hugely effective. Billy Graham didn't enjoy hip hop, but or actually, I don't know, maybe he was a huge fan. To my knowledge, Billy Graham was not a big into hip hop, but when the group DC Talk came along, that came out of Jerry Falwell's Liberty University and put Jerry Falwell's conservative talking points, set it to music. When Billy Graham saw that, he thought to himself, yes, like this is what kids of the 90s are into. And he put them on his stage. He did that also with Amy Grant and many other artists. But I don't know if that addresses what you're asking, but in many ways, what I have worked on is how pop music, but just popular culture, American celebrity culture and media savvy, those things, oftentimes in religious studies circles, we have a really institutional view. Like we think to ourselves, oh, if you want to know what conservative Christians are into, you should look at the Southern Baptist Convention, at their bylaws, at their arguments. And truth be told, they're very fun to watch because they put everything out on, like if you want to know what's going on, you can watch them duke it out over any major issue in, like in front of everyone. That's been happening as of this taping very recently. But most evangelical Christians in the United States are not attentive to institutions. Like if you even ask the average Southern Baptist what denomination they belong to, I don't know if they could tell you, unless their church has Southern Baptist in the title, and many of them don't. They're named after like housing complexes, like or Imagine Church or something like that. Like, do those people even know what denomination they belong to? Same, especially could apply to the Assemblies of God. No,
Absolutely.
Very few evangelicals operate that way. So attending to celebrity and popular culture and in this case music, I think that's really important in the Christian movement because music has always been a very important part of worshiping God and community formation and identity creation and all that. So if you look at the music, you see another story that the institution doesn't give to you. And that's been my obsession for some time. It's a longer story, but I grew up in Pentecostalism, and it's been the surprise of my life to see the people who were on the fringes of the American political sphere and the halls of power in American Protestantism come to the center and in fact now be in prominent places in the White House. And how did they do that? I would argue that their music was a major way that they did that. The beginning of God Gave Rock and Roll to You, the Assemblies of God are the sort of like, they feel really lucky to be invited to the National Association of Evangelicals. They can't even believe it. They have a surprise, like there's recorded comments of surprise that I put in the book. And by the end, you have Paula White Cain as the top advisor to Donald Trump. It's an extraordinary ascent. And Paula White Cain understood when she started networking people with the Trump administration, she understood how important it was to get musicians and celebrities in there. So when you see big pictures of people praying over Donald Trump, a lot of them are worship leaders. And I know for sure that someone in the Trump administration, probably several someones, understands that and has put it to very powerful use.
So how do we get, how do we go from, I think in the movie Detroit Rock City, they called them like Knights in Satan's Service, right? Like the kids were going out to a concert and the mom was like, I don't want you singing rock and roll because that's all satanic music, like how do we go from like that to, maybe some of our modern day versions of, I don't know if you call it contemporary Christian music, but like Skillet, and other bands kind of like that. It seems like within the history of the church, sort of the importance of like how the music is played has shifted over the years. So I'd love for you to just kind of help us understand that.
Oh, yeah. Now you're going to have to just cut me off here because I could go I could talk until Jesus returns about this. Yeah. So, yeah, the really fascinating story. One of the things that I tried to argue in the book is that people will look at rock concerts and not see the origins, that if you look at them through the origins or the communities that created rock, you can see it. But I would argue that rock and roll is essentially a form of revivalism. So, and the reason why I would argue that is because revivalist communities created were core to creating rock and roll. So in the book, I talk about how Black Southern Pentecostal churches are kind of one of the most powerful engines in creating the genre of rock music. And it comes Black and white Pentecostal practitioners, including people like Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis and Little Richard, who was really influenced by Black Pentecostalism. These folks create music that sounds like Pentecostal church music, but then is about something else. My favorite version of this that I put in the book is Jerry Lee Lewis takes a phrase that is right out of rural Southern Pentecostal communities, and the phrase is used to describe the moment in the second chapter of Acts where the Holy Spirit descends and appears over people's heads like a tongue of fire, and then people start speaking in tongues, and that's the birth of the church. And in Southern Pentecostal communities, a way to refer to that would be great balls of fire. Like, woo, the Holy Spirit is on me. The Lord has descended upon me. Great balls of fire. Now, I don't know if you need reminding, but the song Great Balls of Fire is not actually about the moment of like Pentecostal worship. It is about it is thinly veiled reference to sex. And I think can you imagine what these poor Pentecostal church ladies, the Pentecostal moms, must have thought when they heard music that sounds like the music of the church, using the language of the church, talking about sex. Goodness gracious. I'm a Christian mom. I can only imagine their shock, right? So the story of rock and roll is really the story of these rural Southern Pentecostal, Black and white Pentecostal communities that are using all these other forms, many of traditional Black music forms, to create pop music that takes off all over the world. So in the 1950s and the 1960s, white communities and their rejection of rock, it often was a proxy conversation to talk about civil rights, right? So rock and roll and the civil rights movement, those are happening around the same time. And so a lot of anti-rock rhetoric was really, it was being used as a proxy conversation to be anti-civil rights conversations. And there are other historians who've done way more work on that than I have. Randall Stevens is one, Arlene Sanchez Walsh is another. But the Pentecostals, their frustration with rock and roll was actually that it was the music of the church that was being used out in the public sphere in unholy ways. So the holy music of the church was being used in unholy ways. There were a lot of attempts to squash the rise of rock. There were some cities who tried to ban it, kind of like Footloose, a real life version of Footloose. There were some churches tried to put up other forms of music that could compete with rock. And you get these jazz choirs, like youth jazz choirs, and you get folk music. And it had limited success. Why? Because rock was cool. And American teens wanted to engage in it, and it felt more authentic to them. So in the book, I talk about how it takes a decade or so. But in the 1960s, actually a little over a decade, in the late 1960s, there's a group of what I call hippieized Christians. So adolescents who moved to California as part of the kind of sex, drugs, rock and roll hippie movement. They go to Haight-Ashbury. They participate in all of the worldly things that they think will give their lives meaning. They come up empty, and instead they find Jesus. So they have this mystical experience with God, but they're adolescents, and a lot of them are involved in counterculture and in those musical circles as well. And so they start creating music that is fueled by a mystical experience with Jesus by young people for other young people. So it's not by parents trying to, give music to their children that will keep them safe. It's these young people who've had these really radical experiences. Those young people, most of them find a home in Pentecostal denominations that are either established denominations like the Foursquare Church. So people like Keith Green and second chapter of Acts find a home in those types of churches. Some of them find a home in newly established churches that the creation of those churches is interwoven with that story. If you've seen the movie Jesus Revolution, Calvary Chapel, the Vineyard, and those communities are really the core of what becomes contemporary Christian music because they keep that going. So they start creating spaces for young people to create music that is rock music. So they're not afraid of rock. So it takes a little while for particularly white and emerging suburban evangelical communities, because the whole suburban project was getting started in the mid 20th century. And so along the way, the communities that once rejected rock and roll start to see it as a resource. And eventually, Billy Graham, who was always an early adopter when it came to media and stuff like that, he decides when he is planning a massive revival meeting that is supposed to be the counter version to Woodstock in 1972, he co-creates this big revival called Explo 72 in Dallas, Texas. And who does he think of, to headline this? It's those hippieized Christians. So he brings a bunch of folks, and not just them. He also brings some Black gospel and Southern gospel artists, and then people who transcend, people like Andre Crouch. And if you know anything about the history of gospel music, he's a superstar, kind of a proto version of Kirk Franklin that just goes in every genre of music. But the story of how these communities accept rock really is the story of how they created it and then rejected it and then accepted it again.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Women were vital to the history of American Christianity. But now growing numbers of women are quitting the church over misogyny, abuse, racism, homophobia, and the big banner that seems to connect it all, Christian nationalism. I'm Sarah Stancorp, and my new book, Damned If She Does, is about why millions of American women have quit church and what it means for the future. Keep listening at the end of this episode for an exclusive Faithful Politics sneak peek.
I really like that. The story is a really, really fascinating one. And it makes me, again, just realize when we go back and we're trying to understand a culture, and we're trying to understand how people feel, and we go to the politicians, we go to, these official reports, we go to, and all that stuff is great. Like for me, I'm like, where's the data? Where's the data? I need inferences. I need, professional, peer-reviewed, all this stuff, which is great. We all need that because of the methodological constraints that are brought, the methods that are expected that kind of make up for the bias that everyone has. And yet, right, what really forms people, it seems, is the music they listen to, the television shows they watch, the 90-second reels on TikTok they look at that tell them all the things that they need to do in their religion and psychology and all this stuff. And I say it sarcastically, but it's definitely reality. I think this is how people are formed. They're formed through, or especially right now, right? They didn't have TikTok in the 70s, but right now they're being formed in these small snippets that are telling them, reinforcing things that they already think, and potentially even creating hybrid things, right? How many things that we have in Christian theology that are probably really either blasphemous, unorthodox in some way or whatever, but it's a popular belief, right? Because that it's been represented in some simplified way, either in song or some kind of really repeatable phrase that a preacher says, "Come on, somebody," something like that. But then, let go, let God. So you have these things, right, that then encapsulate this whole idea in this phrase. And yet when you bring that out, there's a lot of mystery there. And I guess the question that I'm really getting to is, when we're looking at this, obviously it's helped create this identity. It's formed identity in a very significant way. And you even said people are using this to try to help form more identity or more beliefs. And I guess my question in this is that, was this really was it about creating something that we already believed, evangelicals believed, like some kind of orthodox thing? Or was it more about shaping a new belief, shaping something, or is it neither of those and some kind of hybrid there?
Well, I love that question. And I think, so the story, in my mind, the story of contemporary Christian music is the story of how the marketplace forms theological and political and social ideas in the United States and also abroad. So contemporary Christian music, the way I study it in this book is that I look at the top selling artists, basically the top 40 and really the top 25, because there's a huge drop off in terms of sales and influence based on, the top 20, top 25. And what we see is that there are all kinds of governing bodies. So they might be denominations, parachurch organizations, political parties that are theologians and Christian universities that are contending for Christian orthodoxy out in the public sphere, and then also pastors that are continually routed by the marketplace, right? So they will say, for example, an early example of this that I found in the book is the theology of premillennial dispensationalism. And I assume that your audience doesn't need for me to define premillennial dispensationalism, but that idea was not widely accepted in Baptist circles. And it wasn't a traditional Baptist theology and doctrine. But what happened was there were these holiness and Pentecostal people who were writing hymns that sold really well in hymnals and in songbooks, and then eventually were very popular on the radio. Songs about the millennial morning, or songs about the rapture and the trumpet of God. And you give Baptists a couple of decades singing that song, all of a sudden it becomes official doctrine, right? Because it sold better. And then once you get the advent of radio, and then especially recorded music where people are buying albums for themselves and they're buying recordings, they're playing them in their homes, they're listening to them on the radio, the rank and file consumers start exercising a lot of theological power. And the number one consumer, the person who was the number one theological, political gatekeeper, the person who any person I interviewed in contemporary Christian music in the industry was terrified of making angry, was the core buyer of contemporary Christian music, the evangelical mom. So through the marketplace, women who would not have been seen as power brokers if you look at, the thought leaders of the era. So if you look at the James Dobsons or the Billy Grahams, you're not going to assume that women have a lot of power, but through their shared buying power, these women were driving theological conversations. In fact, they were so powerful that record labels would often make a lot of decisions about what types of music got signed and played based on selling to these women. In the early aughts, they developed digital marketing technologies so that they could track these women and understand who they were pretty well statistically. They gave them a marketing persona of Becky. So Becky's I laughed so hard when I learned that for so many.
Lisa wasn't Karen,
Is it
right?
kind of like Karen? I was thinking,
I
it's
know,
got to
I
be
know,
Becky,
I know.
Karen.
Becky's, in some minority reports, they said Lisa, but Becky's drove contemporary Christian music. They were driving theological conversations, and the appeal to them, the mandate that they had received was from thought leaders, people like James Dobson and many other figures, who told them that first, adolescence, like the teen years, were the most critical years that they needed to watch over their children. It's kind of funny because the category of adolescence was a fairly new category at that time. So people didn't necessarily even think about teens and adolescence as like a critical time in the same way. So they were taught that the teen years were the years that you really needed to intervene and look out for your children, that they were in danger because American society overall was a very dangerous place. For example, they could be influenced by the devil's music, by rock and roll, that they needed to, especially in the 80s, you get the satanic panic. I mean, Becky's were all about that, right? In the 80s. People like Tipper Gore, by the way, very high profile Becky in a lot of ways. They were seeking to protect their children and raise their children up in the faith. And they were told that creating essentially a protective sphere that was a media-driven sphere, so Christian music, Christian movies, Christian radio, Christian bookstores and Christian books and Christian apparel and Christian everything. And Christian I'm using as a marketing category. It's a very specific version of Christianity, conservative evangelical Protestantism, mostly white. But they were assured, and in some ways, this is a prosperity theology, right? So James Dobson might say, if you raise your children according to these principles, you will, if not guarantee, very much increase the odds that they will be healthy, prosperous, upstanding American citizens, right? And for many suburban evangelical women, that was a big part of how they raised their children in the faith. So this is about catechesis through the marketplace. This is about catechesis, Christian formation through consumption, which is a really fascinating thought. If you think about the history of the Christian tradition, I ask my students all the time, how do you make Christians? How do you do that? You know, and Christians have used different methods over time. The story of contemporary Christian music is the story of how an ascendant American empire that it has ascended in large part through the marketplace and through, as well as through the military industrial complex, answered that question. So with the rise of American style capitalism and marketing and celebrity culture, you get an intuition, a push to catechize people through those methods. And in the book, I try to record that it has mixed results. And I try to be even-handed and include a lot of different accounts of people for whom it was and is still the core of their Christian spiritual experience, and then others for whom the very specific, the narrow boundaries around what the articulation of Christian theology and identity was, it just was not tenable for them. And in some cases, it was in fact damaging to their Christian faith and traumatizing, and which I think only speaks to its power.
You know, I'm curious if you think the CCM industry has tried to, decide who counts as Christian music and who doesn't, and put guardrails kind of around that. And the reason I'm asking you is the one example that comes to mind is the 3-button controversy that I talked about earlier with Amy Grant. So I'd love for you just to kind of help us kind of understand how does CCM determine who's in and who's out, and in what ways are they doing that? And if the Amy Grant example is not a good example of that, you can pick another one.
Oh, that's a great example. I actually love the story that you told about your own assumption that a song, that Hallelujah would be a good church song. I think is a great example of you understanding what is just a fact, that Christian themes are everywhere in American art and culture. You don't even have to be Christian to utilize them. And Hallelujah is a great example of that uses a lot of scriptural references as well. But also, a lot of people who are Christians create art that does not, and create music that did not serve that market niche. Probably the best example of that I write about in the book is the band U2. So Bono is very publicly a Christian, and yet U2 made very little impact directly in contemporary Christian music. Now, they had huge indirect influence, because most people who were my Gen X brothers of that era, they were deeply formed by the music of U2, and so created a lot of music that sounded a lot like U2, and in fact, a lot of worship music sounded a lot like U2. So they were influential in that way, but they were not contemporary Christian music artists, right? Why? Because they did not conform to conservative, white, evangelical, Protestant norms appropriately, right? They were singing about things that were outside the boundaries of evangelicalism. And then also because they weren't marketed as such. So they were marketed as a mainstream rock band. And of course, they were like one of the biggest rock bands in the world. And someone like Amy Grant was a very, very rare person who crossed over from contemporary Christian music into the mainstream. In fact, I would argue she's probably the only true crossover artist. A lot of people tried it and they weren't really able to succeed, in part because, back to the original kind of origins of the project, contemporary Christian music was not cool. And by that I mean, it was created to create a counter narrative to whatever was cool. So if Madonna is out there singing songs, transgressive songs about sex and her experience as a young woman experiencing sex, Amy Grant was expected to give listeners a chaste version of that. And she mostly did. And the controversies around her and her life, the 3-button controversy actually happened when her label re-released her first album with a new picture. And this was when she was very young, where she has the first 3 buttons of her blouse were unbuttoned. If you look at the picture, you can Google it. It is a very modest picture, not even a hint of cleavage or anything like that. But the idea that she might be seen as sexual or sexually appealing was just anathema. So all these Beckys called their local Christian bookstore, which is where contemporary Christian music was distributed from, and said, you take her albums off the shelves, and the Christian bookstore folks complied for a while. She was just so charming and so fantastic, though. That one didn't last. Her divorce, though, years later, really did make an impact. The women of contemporary Christian music, much more so than the men, although the men were accountable to this marketplace as well. But the women really had to walk a tightrope, because sex and sex appeal is a huge part of being an American pop star, right? Like, that's just like people's sexiest man alive, right? Like, that is a big part of being an American celebrity. Contemporary Christian artists, though, were supposed to ostensibly reject that message, but also create again, this is a kind of prosperity theology, create a visual representation of the model evangelical life that was so attractive and so appealing that people would be drawn to Christ, right? So Amy Grant, I don't know how she did it. She is an extraordinary person. Everyone I've talked to that knew her personally was very protective of her, loves her, can't say enough good things about her. But what she was expected to do was, in public, lead this ideal evangelical life and be sexually attractive and appealing enough for men to want to marry her and have sex with her, not in the context, not outside the context of marriage. But then, wait, were they not supposed to do that? Was she responsible if they found her attractive? Because, by the way, one of the most beautiful, I've seen her in real life, one of the most beautiful human beings that you will ever see. Just like, wow, it factor. And so she was in some ways expected to be this beautiful, perfect icon, but then also was punished when she was too beautiful, right? Or too attractive. I don't know how she did it, but every woman in contemporary Christian music had that experience. One that I include in there is Leslie Phillips, who was, Amy Grant was the top selling person by far, but there were other people like Leslie Phillips, who is an incredible musician. She actually went on, I didn't get this detail in the book. She went on to be the person who created music for the Gilmore Girls. So if you like Gilmore Girls music, that's her. She's her name is Sam Phillips and is an incredibly accomplished musician. But when she was a contemporary Christian music artist, she was so frustrated by all these constraints. Like she would sing a song. She sang a beautiful song and people would listen to it and think that it sounded too sexy and then complain to her. And she's like, I'm just singing. I mean, she'd be singing about Jesus, and she grew so frustrated by it. She talked to her record label and said contemporary Christian music labels often had morality clauses, which those were present in mainstream things too. Like, for a mainstream artist, if you destroy too many hotel rooms with drug-addled whatevers, that's going to put your contract under threat. But for contemporary Christian music artists, it was very strict adherence to evangelical codes. So according to her, she approached her record label and said, I've had sex before marriage or outside of marriage, and I'm not going to hide it. And they let her out of her contract. So it was very intense.
That's wild.
I know it's wild, right? But the pressure was so intense for the artists. People like Russ Taff, who was struggling with alcoholism, people like Ray Boltz, who was gay, people like who did not conform to these strict codes, often really suffered privately while they were publicly held up as examples. And the artists themselves expressed, anxiety and just the stress of it. But I think what's helpful, what I try to keep in mind, is that the fans of contemporary Christian music, the people who are consuming it, were also experiencing that on a micro level. So that, oftentimes that the intense pressure to appear happy and healthy and like everything's fine applied to, within just rank and file evangelicals as well, because it's difficult to live a perfect life out in public and always be happy.
It is very difficult. Well, it's impossible, really. At some point, right? It's not going to work anymore. At some point, something's going to happen and people are going to see it. And there's going to be some kind of reaction. And the public light, the public stage is so unforgiving. There is no grace in it. Right. It's like the place that's probably the most antithetical in some ways to the Spirit of Christ, I would think, is the public sphere that basically cancels, hates, any mistake will destroy you for it, because that's how people are as a group, right? We have, as individuals, I think, a lot of grace, and groups can have grace, but I think for whatever the group dynamics, whatever happens, once it gets onto that public stage, it's nasty. And, part of what I think is happening, what makes this so interesting is, again, the way that music forms us, that then the environment it creates, right? That people have to be up there. They're these almost like perfect examples, even though if someone can sing, what's the correlation between someone having talent and singing and being moral or being really strong morally? There isn't necessarily, right, a correlation at all. There isn't one. That's my point. There is no correlation between that. And yet, so somehow we have to find the people that are good at singing, and either they need to be perfect, we have to force them to be perfect, or we have to make sure they look perfect. Creating this false image that people look to and maybe even themselves worship, themselves put up to some kind of pedestal that they can't actually accomplish. And I guess thinking about how this affected not just culture, but even people's sense of being American, sense of being even their political the way that they enter into the politics. And I'm taking away from the politics of being, hey, Republican, Democrat. I'm talking about the public sphere, that they're entering into this politics in the public sphere. How does music, and how did this music in particular that you studied, how did this actually shape how people saw things, like shaped how they made value judgments? If something is sacred, if something is bad, dangerous, threatening, good, worth defending, how did music create that narrative and send that message?
Well, I love that question. And since this podcast is about American politics, I'm gonna answer with one example from the book that took place at the U.S. Capitol, because that just feels right here. The short answer is that any social movement, music is core to a major social movement. You look in from biblical times, from ancient times on, if you want to get a bunch of people together to do something and act together, there's nothing as efficient and as portable as music to do that for you. So this is not a new thing, but in contemporary Christian music world, I'll give you an example of how the music shaped the intellectual and political trajectory of the movement. So in the early 1990s, in response to some Clinton era sex education efforts in American public schools and in international aid, conservative evangelical Christians were really concerned about how sex ed was being done in public schools. And so they developed abstinence-only initiatives in public and private schools. And that got it. There were some organizations like the True Love Waits organization, the Southern Baptist organization, another one called the Silver Ring thing, grew up in response to that. To really rally the troops and get everyone excited about it, they held a big concert at the U.S. Capitol, and they had hundreds of thousands of purity pledges. So notes that said, that adolescents pledged to not engage in sexual activity outside of marriage. And they made this pledge and they put them on the U.S. Capitol lawn. I remember when I learned that, because I was a little too young to know about that. And I was raised in white Pentecostalism in a really working class community. So we were outside the kind of middle class communities where contemporary Christian music really thrived. Like in my church, we didn't have money to send people to conferences all the time, which is where you really had to get all that stuff, or concerts even, So I was kind of in some ways raised outside of it economically. But I called my dad and I was like, Dad, did you know that in the 90s, like hundreds of thousands of adolescents saying that they weren't going to have sex until they were married were like put on the Capitol lawn? And my dad was like, what? No, that's so weird. And I'm like, I know, right? Because I was like, what? You don't remember it? He couldn't remember it either. So we were just not, we were not invited to that party. But DC Talk was there. Michael W. Smith was there, and many other artists. And they sang songs promoting virginity and abstinence outside of marriage. And many of them were very warning songs, and especially targeted at young women. There were thousands of people who were there. One person who was there as a teenager was the son of a homeschool publisher who was there because there were a lot of Christian publishers and Christian activists, political activist groups that were there, as well as media makers and church leaders. And as a teen, he was so convicted by what he saw out there that he thought to himself, someone needs to do something. We made vows. We need to stay faithful to these vows. How can I do this as an adolescent? And that young man went home, started writing, and he wrote a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. So that was Joshua Harris. I interviewed him for the book because I wanted to know about how evangelical media networks worked, and who better than him to understand about that. But of course, I Kissed Dating Goodbye, I feel like your audience is going to know about that book, was a transformative book in many evangelical lives. And the results, like the fruit of that work, I think has been decidedly mixed, if not a I think many people who grew up in that movement, the purity culture movement, have recognized some of the flaws of it, including the fact that, according to most studies, making those vows doesn't necessarily prevent you. In fact, on the whole, it doesn't prevent teens from engaging in premarital sex, but it ramps up the guilt that they feel and the trauma that they experience around it. So the results are quite mixed, but this form of activism was very powerful, and it resulted in concrete policy decisions nationally and locally and even internationally. So evangelical practitioners exerted a tremendous amount of influence in the public sphere. And that one concert was just the beginning of partnerships between evangelical music makers and policy makers. There were groups, as you know, as the 90s progressed into the early aughts, who kind of their main thing was singing about that. People like Rebecca St. James and Barlow Girl. And that had national and international political consequences. And so that's just one example, but there are dozens and dozens of examples. I think the one that I would cite right now is the worship music industry, which is in many ways distinct but an overlapping industry. Worship artists have been at the core of Trump-oriented activism in the United States, right? So there have been, when there are political rallies, back in the pandemic era, against wearing masks or against restrictions around church gatherings, worship artists were there. When there were counter rallies to Black Lives Matter gatherings, worship artists were there. At the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, worship songs were core to it. How Great Is Our God, Waymaker, like those types of songs were energizing those communities. And also the theologies of those songs are shaping a lot of the most powerful forms of conservative activism, the triumphalism, the emphasis on spiritual warfare, the idea of Christian dominion. Those ideas are oftentimes first experienced through song. And I would argue most powerfully experienced through song. Reading a book or even hearing a sermon about it is not going to do the same thing for you as singing it does. I think all of us have experienced that in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah, it seems like at the Capitol, they really missed an opportunity to play that one Corey Ashbury song, the there's no wall too tall, to separate God's love. You know what I mean? Like, are you familiar with the song?
You know what I love? I love that you're giving critical feedback here because I have one too. So those communities, because this is mostly Pentecostal and charismatic Christianities. It's stuff that I grew up with. So it's wild to see it in this context for me. Having grown up, I grew up doing Jericho marches around a local bar, right? Like we were praying for that bar to close down. And this is going to crack. The story cracks me up and it'll make my mom laugh too. I remember we prayed for that bar to close and I didn't know that actually profit margins, it's hard to make a bar unprofitable, right? But in my hometown, it closed down like 25 years later and I called my mom and I was like, it worked, the Jericho March. But anyway, we were doing Jericho marches for that. So to see it at the U.S. Capitol was, wow, what an experience. But the thing that the critical feedback I would have for the charismatics that I saw was, why do you got to be using a shofar? Shofars are actually really hard to play. Pentecostals own the tambourine. Anyone can play the tambourine well. So I'm like, come on, pick an instrument that's easier to play is my advice.
That's a tambourine. Yeah. And they're cheap too. Come on, people.
You don't even need to.
They're very cheap, but they can really mess you up. But I guess no less than the shofar, I imagine. If you're like playing and you're when you're trying to do something, I can imagine it being distracting.
There are very funny kind of bloopers too, where people, because they're actually super hard to play. And then in charismatic circles, there's always, because charismatics are another political thing that's really influential in our current context. They're very Zionistic as a whole. And so there's always a cultural pressure to get one from the Holy Land, so you got to get it internationally. You can get a tambourine. I can get a tambourine just walking down the street. So anyway.
That's so funny. Well, Leah, so this is my final question for you. So 250 years of religion in America. You know, there's a lot to talk about. I mean, we're recording 16 episodes of it, right? So, but I think that the anniversary of the country means something to different people, especially if the part of American history you've been focused on for so long, is right in front of you. So I'd love for you just to kind of give us some reflection. Like, what does America 250 kind of really mean to you? Love to hear you.
Oh, wow. What a great question. Well, I teach American religious history in, year in, year out. And every year I'm always struck by all the things that are old that remain. So I'm reflecting on the legacy of specific Christian communities and how that continues to play itself out over time. One example would be in the early weeks of a class that I teach on American religious history, we look at Baptists and Quakers, and we look at them as some of the original advocates and really creators of American concepts of religious liberty. And then the last time I taught the history of Christianities in the United States, we had just read about Roger Williams, famous figure, and the Quakers in what eventually becomes the United States. And then we read about how some of the first religious communities to legally challenge the Trump administration's policies regarding detaining people outside of churches through ICE, the communities who challenged that the first were Baptists and Quakers, right? So hundreds of years later, there are legacies of action in public and efforts to shape the American political project through their Christian conviction that you're seeing hundreds of years after the first communities even created our understandings of that. And to me, that is fascinating to watch and kind of thrilling to watch as well. So my students this year were enamored with the Pope, an American Pope, in conflict with an American president, because we had just read about Catholic immigration waves in the 19th century and all the anti-Catholic stuff, and then the challenge of JFK, his Catholic identity, and like that posed in the 1960s. And then here we are in the 2020s with these two figures that create quite a contrast with one another. So I don't know if that answers your question in terms of my hopes, but I think the things that are fascinating to me to watch are how the DNA of those communities, how it gets expressed over time. Like you can't, and it's not all Baptists that were into that, by the way. There are plenty of Baptists who are very supportive of the Trump administration. But the communities that sought to challenge it on grounds of religious liberty have been doing that for hundreds of years. So I think I'd like to see more public action like that, where communities are responding to their best angels historically and are continuing to contend for the public good of Americans in the future.
That is so awesome. Well, Leah Payne, thank you so much for coming on our show. There's so much we didn't even get to. I wanted to ask you about Carmen and all kinds of other.
Wait a minute, we got to talk about Carmen. Yeah, because you went to an Assemblies of God church.
I did.
I grew up in Assemblies of God. I was an Assemblies of God minister. My dad was in denominational leadership in the Assemblies of God. Absolutely. My parents, my wife is an Assemblies of God minister. I actually resigned my credentials, but personally, but most of my family is Assemblies of God.
Okay, wait a minute. We need a follow-up conversation because Carmen, can I just, do I have time to?
Please, yeah.
So Carmen, he was one who no one in the industry liked at all. They thought his art was bad. They thought he was super gaudy and embarrassing, and they thought his theology was bad. But Carmen, and his origin story is the most perfect origin story. He converted to evangelical Christianity at Disneyland while attending an Andre Crouch concert. If Disneyland and Andre Crouch had a baby, it would be Carmen, right? So Carmen, I knew he was important. And I talked with my former boss, Charlie Peacock, who's a really influential figure in contemporary Christian music. And I kept saying, everyone's telling me that Carmen wasn't as big of a deal as I think he was. Like, what do you think? And he said, oh, no. He was a huge deal. Why? Because, okay, Christian theology people oftentimes, like in mainstream evangelicalism, didn't like the theology that he had. The industry thought he was embarrassing. But you know who loved him? Becky's. Because he looked like a soap star, right? So he was, they all had crushes on him, but also he was fun. Like, and he brought a rock'em sock'em Pentecostal, he was like the Pentecostal kids, Michael Jackson, this really imaginative universe with these creative music videos. And he basically imported a Pentecostal horror aesthetic into evangelicalism. And we can have a follow-up conversation about that, but yes. Carmen. Why didn't we start with Carmen?
I saw Carmen in a concert. It was in Washington State, and some time ago. Again, this is all like B-roll material, but we will get back to this at some other time. Thank you so much, Leah Payne, for keeping it weird for us. It has been.
I love it. I love the weird stuff.
Pleasure. And to our audience, hey, thanks again for stopping by Church and State 250. Make sure you check out all of our other episodes if you haven't. Prior to this one, there is a lot you need to catch up on if you haven't watched any of the other ones. But as always, make sure you always keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye. All right. Hey, welcome back to Faithful Politics and for our brief little interview with the one and only Sarah Stancorp. How's it going, Sarah?
Good. It's going well. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, so at this year's Southern Baptist Convention, and I'm no expert, but I can read the news, they voted overwhelmingly to advance some sort of formal ban on churches with women pastors. And your book, Damned If She Does, looks at why women are leaving the church and what that means for the future of religion. So I'd love for you just to, maybe give us like, what's one story that helps explain how a decision like what happened at the SBC shouldn't really surprise anybody?
So when I had the idea to write this book probably over a decade ago, I thought it would be very contemporary and how now we're decades hence. And when I sat down to write the book, I realized I actually needed to start in the 1980s because a lot of the threads that became important in women's lives started then. And I know this mini interview may become part of a broader conversation on Christian nationalism. As I look at the way evangelicalism, how the Christian right has embedded itself with our politics and really turned into a Christian nationalist machine, a big piece of that is Christian patriarchy. The way women are oppressed within this system is kind of a model for oppression of all of us. So jumping back to the beginning of the book, I started with Danuta Soderman, who was a co-host of the 700 Club with Pat Robertson. And she was granted a bit of influence there. She could talk to the country. She could even preach sometimes. God forbid. But she also was bounded by certain rules. She could have this influence if she followed certain rules. And as soon as she didn't, as soon as she was a threat that Robertson needed to dispose of, she was gone. When I think about the SBC, and I think about just year after year, amendments like this come up, attempting to silence women after women have worked so hard to press SBC for reform on sex abuse. This is no coincidence. When I look at that trajectory, and there are still women in SBC, many are leaving, a lot of people have left SBC, I see women who are making some sort of compromise. And they're there, whether it's for comfort or community or because they're too scared to leave and they know what they'll lose if they leave. They're making a deal, but they're eventually gonna lose. And I think that's the heartbreaking part of seeing what's happening now within that denomination is bad for the church. It certainly isn't good evangelism, but it's also so bad for women who, the longer they stay and tolerate being treated like this, it breaks them down. And eventually the only way to safety is to leave.
Wow. Well, your book, Damned As She Does, when does it come out and where can people buy it?
September 15th, and everywhere we can get a book, you can buy a book there. It's going to be a big publication day. A bunch of other big books are coming out then. So I'm hopeful September is going to be a good month for dialogue about faith in America, especially in our current political situation.
Yeah. And your website?
sarahstancorp.com.
That's easy. And I will make sure all of this is in the show notes. And thanks again, Sarah, for stopping by and telling us about your book.
Thank you.
Awesome.